everyone. Nice to meet you. Good afternoon. I'm Terry. I go by 0xTayTayHo on Twitter. And I work for 1KX, where I largely focus on investments in gaming, NFTs. Previously came from a mathematics background, not that related, but I'm Korean, so I've been a lifelong gamer for all my life. So today I want to talk about the history of game governance. Nothing prescriptive. I just want to go through what's available, what's out there, why you might want to think about this, and what that sort of means for the future of crypto gaming. All right, so why do you want to think about this? As crypto games move to decentralization as part of the ethos of Web3, I think it's important to think about what governance models do you want to adapt, and what has been done in the past that has worked, and what has been done in the past that perhaps hasn't worked so well. And also, personally, it was a lot of fun for me as a gamer to go back to all these games and look at the history. So what is game governance? I broadly define it as the ability of players and other stakeholders in the ecosystem to have a say in the development of the game. A lot of people have this misconception that prior to the advent of the internet or the widespread use of the internet, there's no way for dev studios to really connect deeply with their players. But this is actually not true. We gamers have always been persistent and kind of annoying about the things that we want in the games that we play. And the earliest example I could find was actually Ultima. If you guys are familiar with the series, it's one of the sort of most widely played RPGs in the world. And when Ultima 3 was first released, it was an absolute hit. But a lot of people were very mad at the sort of satanic and demonic imagery and the fact that you could really get away and play the game by killing and looting the villagers. And so a lot of people sent the creator Richard Garriott these very, very angry messages to his sort of home, his office, and they called him, and they were bombarding him with suggestions about what they wanted to see different. And this quote I found, he says, when anybody writes to you about the game, they're basically saying, oh, I love it, but here's also 10 pages of how I would change it. And so Richard Garriott, took this feedback and he ruminated on it for a little bit. He said, actually, I do want to sort of offer people a different experience. I don't want people to know or to think that this game is somehow encouraging these bad activities. And so he came up with this system of morality. And it was the first time I ever know, at least, where this was reflected, where you would undergo these activities that sort of have kind of not black and white, but gray area moral implications. And for example, you could take shortcuts. You could rob a shopkeeper or offer them lower than the value of the item and pay them less than that. But the game would actually track that. And it would result in consequences for you trying to do other activities. But as an initial player, you wouldn't actually know about it. So I actually went back, downloaded it, played it a little bit. And this was an instance I found pretty early on where you enter into a room and there is a little child and a bull. And the little child is scared of the bull and asks you to kill it for you. And when you kill the bull, you get chased out of the village because it's actually the villager's pet. But you don't know that at the start. So actually, Richard Garriott talks about how the system of morality was devised because of the feedback he received. But what's also important to know was it necessarily wasn't a sort of, okay, people suggested this, let's directly reflect this into the game procedure, right? He understood what sort of people wanted, what people were thinking about. He ruminated how to reflect that into the game and came up with this completely novel system. And Ultima 4 is considered one of the best games of all time. In the late 80s to the early 90s, as people started getting access to the internet, I'm not sure, I wasn't there, but university students, they were using Usenet forums and BBSs, and they were essentially sort of these early iterations of forums. And one of the first things that people did there was talk about how to beat games and create gaming communities. And I think a lot of the early sort of teams realized that there were these congregating communities on these forums, and they decided to go on these forums and actually communicate with the community. So this is an example from Doom. I don't know if any of you guys use this, but this is, I think, Hank Lukert's a Doom official guide. It's a couple hundred pages FAQ on how to beat Doom, going through the whole game. And in the process, he actually iterated the FAQ with John Romero, the founder of id Software, David Taylor and Jay Wilbur. And it's actually documented quite well here in these like Usenet forums that are very, very hard to find about how they had these conversations about sort of the game, about what was wrong in the FAQ. And what was interesting to me was this is actually one of the first examples I could find where developing studios would try to directly communicate with their audience, right? So this is David Taylor posting about like a new version of Doom and asking for people to play test it and email him feedback. Another example from that times, like John Carmack used to publish these .plan files. So every day he did something. It was sort of like today's dev journals and blogs. He would post sort of everything he worked on that day. I believe this is from 1996 or 7, February 18th. And I could use the finger protocol to go in and look at exactly what happened and what was worked on that day as a player. And sort of the translation from what happened here as, actual forums and Reddit became popular was that, a lot of players would go onto these forums and then aggregate player suggestions and sort of talk to the devs very actively, from which developing studios could extract information about what the players wanted, the direction of the game that the players wanted, then reflect that onto the game. And World of Warcraft was a good example because I believe EverQuest was the first one, but they were also one of the widely popular subscription model games. And they expected people to play for tens of years, a very long period of time. And so if that was the case, they needed to put out content, right, that was favorable to the players, that the players liked. And so the way they used to gauge this was these forums. And this is a screenshot from the Blizzard forums about sort of like curation of the player feedback that has happened over time. And actually, like if you guys remember, some of the things that they actually took into account was they introduced a salon, they introduced account splitting, and they introduced paid account transfer as a result of these player suggestions. All right, now that we sort of move past from these informal mechanisms to much more actually formally defined mechanisms within the game. The first example I could find was the Council of Stellar Management in EVE Online. I don't know if anyone here plays EVE, but within the game, like it's a very, very complex game, a lot of factions, and right, the CCP, which is sort of the developing studio, they decided that at a certain point it was important to empower players with formal communication channels to directly impact the development of the game. And they created this council called the CSM. The CSM has near infinite scope on developing, on sort of advising the role in terms of like, they can advise on things like the long-term scope, different balancing, like any sort of dynamic within the game. And they actually meet in Iceland once a year with the developing team to have an in-person meeting about all these issues. And they act as a sort of representative council for the players in communicating with the developing studio. So this is actually current year CSM. It's one person, one vote. They actually have this very nice tally of the regions as well. But yeah, like they're pioneers of this council system. Beyond Online also uses a similar system where they have a very sort of outline structure of those that are included into the system. So anyone who's a guild master, if you're a rank 1 in in-game player leaderboards, you get included onto this forum where they call it the round table, where you discuss sort of additional developments in the game, where you discuss sort of the direction of the game with developing studio. The next step in formalizing this was done by RuneScape. So I don't know who here play RuneScape. Did anyone here play RuneScape? Yeah, I love RuneScape. So RuneScape had two, if you guys remember, like classic RuneScape had two updates that were very, very controversial, and they lost a lot of players throughout the process. It was called, like, they removed free trade, they removed wilderness, and then they introduced a new combat system. And because of that, they had a lot of player churn. And I believe in 2013, it was actually originated by a YouTuber. He was like an avid RuneScape player back in the day, and he wanted to go back to the old system. So he started a petition on one of the petition websites saying, hey guys, like I really, really love this game, but I don't really like where it has gone. Why don't we open another server from back in the day? And it got, I think, 40,000 signatures. And so RuneScape decided to say, okay, we're going to open an old server if more than X amount of people are interested in it. And they got overwhelming response. And as part of the effort, they introduced these things called polling boxes. They're actually in-game. If you walk into the bank, they're right next to it. And any update that Jagex sort of pushes onto the old school RuneScape game, it must go through this polling system if it has anything to do with content. So if it has anything to do with sort of balancing bug patches, it doesn't. But if it has anything to do with the content or anything that the players might be interested in, then it does have to go through the polling system. Only if it passes with 75% plus of the vote does it get reflected into the actual game. Small sample size, but a lot of the people think it's good for the game at the very least. There's voter participation. The one thing to note about the polling system is that there is no necessarily scope. Like, they don't have to necessarily use it, and it has been one of the criticisms widely levied against RuneScape because a lot of people feel like a lot of the updates that should have been voted on are not. But yeah. Sort of adapting from that system, now that we move on to Web3, is the Illuvium Council. So the way it works is necessarily the Council of Stellar Management plus coin voting. So instead of one person, one vote, those who hold tokens quadratically vote on council members. The council members then vote CSM style on any sort of update that is pushed out by the developing team. As we explore sort of additional ways we can use this, like one idea that I found interesting was reputation scale voting. So if you look at RuneScape, only those with a total level of 300 or above are able to vote, right? But there's a lot of information that we can extract from on-chain data now with these crypto games, especially with NFT-associated games. And so it's possible to like give certain demographics and certain NFT users, certain players, additional voting power under certain dynamics. Right, so one example might be, like take Axie for an example. Like let's take your MMR and then let's equate your voting power to some sort of increasing function of your MMR. Whereas the higher MMR players get more say in whatever is being voted on than lower MMR players. Yeah, that's it for games. I want to talk to you about a little bit about governance systems of virtual worlds. So like one of the earliest player-run virtual worlds I found was this one called LambdaMoo. It was a text-based virtual world. It's kind of hard to imagine, but you would log in and you would see just a description of the world you're in. It's like, hey, you're in a closet. The closet is XYZ. This whole entire virtual world was governed by its players. There's no core team like doing any sort of arbitration, etc. The way it worked was whenever there was a social or civil issue, there was a volunteer teams of arbitrators. Like two people would go to these arbitrators, and then the arbitrators would sort of come to a conclusion about what to do with the social issue. And then the dev team would implement whatever conclusion that was, whether it was banning someone, whether it was banning someone for a period of time, etc. One of the issues was that it didn't form precedent, and it also, by definition, couldn't impact anyone but the people involved. It was very unpopular because of arguments against, people thought it was very corrupt, and it had a hard time scaling even with a couple thousand people. In Linden Labs in Second Life, the way they covered sort of social issues was they used a very broad terms of service and what they called the big six. These were like 6 things that you cannot do. But outside of those realms, they largely resorted to community norms and community organizations. So these included like blacklists for people who wouldn't pay up for services, and arbitration and mediation services with the fact that they were not binding. Yeah, so why do you want to think about this? I was just like reading Castronova's book about economy and market design as content. And in as much as like your economy and markets are content, governance can be content as well. And in fact, people have been thinking about in-game governance as content for a long time. And this you might think of as like guilds or internal organizations, or especially in EVE, it's a great example of someone that's like a fleet commander and them sort of wanting to do dynamics and politics and social organizations, and because it's so hard to master, it raises long-term retention, is the argument. And perhaps there's like a way to catch 2 birds with 1 stone, where you can have meta governance as content and community-first decentralization that goes along with the ethos of Web3. Also, maybe you want to get more feedback. You want to make things that players like. And perhaps there's another necessity and aspect of it, right? A lot of people think of these like games as these nations, and NFTs as sort of the properties that you own in the nations. And a lot of people might not feel safe with their investments. Have they not a say in the ecosystem and the governance rights of how the ecosystem operates? What are the risks? Right. So, John Carmack thinks that a lot of games today are a little bit focus group to death, and everyone's sort of reverting to the mean. That could be one. As the more you integrate player feedback, John Statt, he was one of the first level designers for World of Warcraft. He thinks that he really appreciates player feedback, but a lot of players kind of no idea what's happening behind the scenes, right? There's a lot of factors that the dev studio can't control, like financial, technological, design limitations. And so, like trying to take in player feedback through a more institutionalized mechanism, you might go against these risks. And also, there's a difference between reality and games. Like people might not want to participate that much in these ecosystems. People might not believe that they're that fun, right? And it might ruin sort of the experience. But yeah, that was sort of history of game governance, and this is my contact. Let me know if I can be of any help.